Hi, I'm Ken Fisher. Welcome to the 17th season of CityWide. All year, we're going to be talking about the big issues that impact the lives of New Yorkers. Our subject is jobs, and my guest on this edition of CityWide is Jonathan Bowles, Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
So, mister, where can I get a job?
Gosh, well, there's a lot of restaurants and retail operations that are hiring, but not a lot else. So many people are struggling today because there's a lot of jobs being created at the very high end, things like the tech sector. It's booming in New York, and then at the low end, but there's not a whole lot in the middle.
Where is New York's future in terms of jobs?
Well, I think that this is a knowledge economy, and New York is more than probably any place, this knowledge capital. We're a global economy today. We're competing with the likes of London and Shanghai, and so finance, high-end advertising, legal services, a lot of those kind of knowledge jobs are the kind of things that are going to be growing in the future.
You published a report not long ago about, not just on the tech sector, but specifically the design community within the tech sector. You might consider that either applied technology is one way of looking at it, or as content providers is another way of looking at it. Is that any different than advertising from the Mad Men era?
I mean, it's very much the same thing. I mean, it's all about the internet disrupting all of these traditional industries, so it's advertising but online. So it's ad tech, it's finance, but with kind of a layer of internet underneath it. So it's fintech for financial tech. It's digital media, it's digital publishing, and now increasingly it's things like health technology. And New York has all of these great advantages in all of those traditional industries, and kind of adding that layer of internet is just something that plays to New York's strengths.
There are big sectors, though, of tech in particular, where New York is a laggard. Biotech, we're well behind both California and Massachusetts, and I would argue even to some extent New Jersey because of pharma. Are there some industries that are better suited than New York than others?
Of course, yeah. I mean, for years, New York really struggled with technology because it was never a technical place. There was not a lot of engineers here that, were like they were in Silicon Valley or even places like San Diego. But now the way the internet has just leveled everything, it's about platforms that leverage the internet or mobile technologies. And so people are creating content that sits on the web or on smartphones. It's people selling things online, like e-commerce sites. It's people delivering services via the internet. And all of those things play to New York's strengths because they're about building content or selling things. It's not about creating this 20-person engineering team that's building the wiring that lets the internet run. That's not what New York is really good at. So all of those things, publishing, media, advertising, and how they play off of the internet is really where New York is going to be strong.
So where do we go in terms of the manufacturing sector? Should we give up the ghost, or is there still a role for manufacturing within the city limits?
Well, this is a tough one. Right now, New York City has a smaller share of manufacturing jobs as kind of as a percentage of the overall private sector job total of any big city in the country, actually any major city in America. So there's still about 75,000 manufacturing jobs, but the share is incredibly small, and it's getting smaller. There are no real big manufacturing companies left. But on the good side, there's kind of this movement, this backlash against globalization, where very local people are looking to buy fresh, unique things. And so when it comes to niche food manufacturers, a lot of ethnic food, There's some publishing and printing companies. 3D printing is growing.
Is it material? I mean, you know, think of what the Brooklyn Navy Yard was 40 years ago. Tens of thousands of jobs. If you took all of the pickle and chocolate makers in Brooklyn and lined them up from end to end, I don't think you'd fill the parking spaces at the Navy Yard.
You're absolutely right. It's a fraction of what it was. I guess what's encouraging to me is that for 3 decades or more now, we've had nothing but bad news. We've had nothing but declines in manufacturing, and at least here, we have some growth. I think what we're seeing is kind of the entrepreneurial manufacturing. We hadn't had people starting manufacturing companies for a while. We just had these 30-year-old companies that were trying to hold on, and mostly were not succeeding. So there's some encouragement, but are we going to have the swing line staples that we used to have? Absolutely not. So it's not going to be a major driver of economic growth going forward. And unfortunately, it's a real problem because it was such a source of decent paying jobs for those with limited skills or low levels of educational attainment.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that because you alluded to that right at the top of the show. We've got entry-level jobs, low-wage jobs, service sector jobs, hospitality, et cetera, these tech jobs and others related to them. What's the path for New York if they want to keep a middle class in New York? Or is it an illusion to think that middle-class people have a role in the future of the city?
Wow. Well, you know, we did a study about the middle class a couple years ago, and I think that it's not just about preserving the middle class. I think the real challenge for New York is that the path to the middle class has gotten more arduous than ever. And a big part of the reason is the economy, the changes in the economy. It's no longer possible to get those manufacturing jobs that springboard you to the middle class. Also, in this recession or the post-recession, other middle class industries like construction, government jobs have taken a huge hit. And the things that are growing are jobs that are accessible for people with limited skills or education. Things like retail, restaurants, home health aides. You know, these are not paying enough for you to be middle class. So this is a real concern. I think this is going to be a big issue in the mayoral campaign in 2013. It's getting harder than ever to climb up to the middle class because you can't get a job that pays you wages to support yourself and your family in this high-cost city.
I don't think that most people realize how big a hit the construction industries have taken. Not that long ago, people were complaining about the jackhammers and cranes that seem to be on every block. But if I'm correct about this, at the moment, there are close to 60,000 construction workers in the metropolitan area who are idle. Do you see any prospect of them getting back to work anytime soon?
Wow, this is one of those tough questions. You know, I think that I don't see a return to 2007, you know, booming construction. In some ways, there was kind of overbuilding occurring. I think there was less overbuilding here than in most places in the country, but it may take a couple more years before we start to really see kind of major building even begin again. I mean, think about what it was like in the 1990s. You know, there have been several years where very little was happening, and then it took a little bit of time, and then it really took off. So we might see something like that again. I think that the big opportunity is with regard to infrastructure because, you know, New York City, more than any other city in this country, you know, has so many things that were built in the early part of the 20th century, so many things that are vital to the operation and growth and the quality of life of New York. And so I'd love to see where we get to the point where maybe the governor or the federal government actually puts some funds behind projects that could help us do things like not only the 2nd Avenue subway, but the water and sewer system underneath the streets in the city. Obviously, the Tappan Zee Bridge has to get done, but so does things like the Kosciuszko Bridge, the Goethals Bridge, and so many other things. And so that could create some decent construction movement in the city.
Yes, but, you know, the prospects of the federal government stepping up infrastructure, it seems to me, are slim. The president talked about it at the convention, mentioned it in his acceptance speech. But at the same time, the Congress, you know, absent a Johnson-level landslide, you're going to have a divided Congress regardless of who has control of the houses. But the Congress could barely agree on a surface transportation bill that would benefit many members when they were running for re-election. They were almost willing to forego what I would consider the routine extension of projects that were well underway. So I don't see the prospect for federal spending anytime soon. And the governor, and I've been in discussions with the governor about this, the governor is very focused on getting the Tappan Zee Bridge built on the merits, but also as a way of demonstrating that New York, the Empire State, has not lost its ability to execute on large projects. But I've been in meetings with him when he talked about the Tappan Zee with some passion, and somebody said, "Well, what about the Kosciuszko Bridge?" And he said, "Hey, I got to do one bridge to show that I know how to do it." So, what would it take to capture the public imagination to get people to demand things? Do we have to have a disaster? Do we need a Hurricane Katrina before they start to fix the levees?
Well, look, your assessment of the political situation is absolutely correct, and then I'll add to that the fact that New York State has no money. So, and I think that the voters turned down a Transportation Bond Act a while back. So it's clearly going to be a hard lift. But I would say on the federal level, I'm certainly not naive, but I do think that if employment continues to struggle, and the economy stagnates for another year or two, I think we might see more pressure for more of a kind of infrastructure jobs, something to get things going. Again, obviously it has to get through a Republican Congress, but I do think there will be more pressure for that. At the state level, I think that we might see that just the importance of this to the future of New York. More than other places, the infrastructure is in awful shape. And I think that we're going to have to see. I think we're going to see more business leaders and others, demanding it. And the Kosciuszko Bridge is probably going to fall down.
Right. I think that's going to be one of the tests for the next mayor. Bloomberg, I think to his credit, protected the city's capital budget, billions of dollars that the city spends, pretty well through some very difficult times. He felt it was important to invest for the future. And whether the next mayor feels that way, and whether it's an issue in the campaign where people have to commit to that, it's an open question for me at this point.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one more thing, because I think that we were talking about the middle class, and I think that the transit system and expanding and improving the transit system is probably the single best thing that the city could do to improve the lives of the middle class or expand the middle class. Because if you significantly improve the transit system, you are basically expanding the geography of New York City. Right now, a lot of young professionals and families have been moving further and further out into the boroughs, and those folks that are in those creative and professional occupations that are growing and they're going to continue to grow in New York, they are going to places like Midwood and Jackson Heights, but there's a limit right now, because it takes a little bit of time to get into Manhattan to their jobs. And so they're not going to go out to Coney Island at this point. But if we can improve the transit system, if we can make the commutes fast enough where they can get out to the far reaches of the boroughs, I think we make the city that much more affordable. So again, it's still a hard argument to make, but I'm hopeful, that maybe one of these politicians running next year will start to do that, because I do think the middle class and the struggles that they face are going to be a big issue.
We're going to continue our conversation with Jonathan Bowles when CityWide comes back right after this.
When you throw away money on wasted electricity, you're throwing away everything you could have bought with it. Saving energy saves you money. Learn more at energysavers.gov.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Jonathan Bowles, who heads the New York City think tank, the Center for an Urban Future, and we're talking about jobs. So we may not be able to spend our way into creating new jobs, at least not anytime soon. And we may not be able to keep jobs here, manufacturing jobs, by zoning, by putting parts of the city off limits for anything else, because the market seems to indicate otherwise. What are the policy initiatives that government can do? National, state, New York City, what can government do to stimulate employment?
Well, there's certainly limits, especially on the city level, but obviously real estate-driven projects can do something. So I'll give you one example. Right now, it's been very difficult to create middle-income jobs, and especially there have been some efforts to preserve manufacturing, but that only goes so far right now. But one area that might be an opportunity is port-related warehousing. So, with the changes to the Panama Canal, that's going to allow...
Tell our viewers what that's about, because I think most people are oblivious to it.
Well, basically the Panama Canal is being widened so that the large ships that are now operating and carrying cargo are going to be able to basically go all the way through, and right now they aren't. So ships that are stopping on the West Coast and unloading their cargo are going to now be coming straight to the East Coast. And the New York Harbor has a huge opportunity. There's going to be it's almost certain that New York is going to see a significant increase in cargo coming to its ports. And the Jersey side of the harbor is fairly full when it comes to warehousing facilities. There's been several built in the last decade or two. A lot of them are even being built well down the New Jersey Turnpike. And a lot of these companies really like just-in-time warehousing these days. And so the Staten Island port, Howland Hook, has been growing quite rapidly. And there are a couple sites on Staten Island that could handle additional port-related warehousing. There's some issues, there's some obstacles there, but there is a lot of space there. I mean, the site that people used to talk about, the NASCAR track going to, that crashed, it's not happening. Port-related warehousing could create some decent paying jobs, but there's things that the city or the state and the Port Authority will have to do to make sure that happens. Other things that the city can do, I'd like to see more of a focus on helping people from low income or people with limited educational attainment get to the middle income jobs that are created. Because there are some middle income jobs in New York, but they just require a 2-year degree or some education. So for instance, paralegals. These are jobs that technically don't require a 4-year degree, but in practice they end up going to most people that are, graduating from an Ivy League school or something. There's an opportunity that we can, if we really target this, to get more people from community colleges to make paralegal a career and not a way station. Things like internships and other things. I think we could do a lot better in getting local people from community colleges into finance careers. There's got to be a much more robust internship program for a lot of those kind of things. I think also community colleges are a very overlooked part of the kind of middle income platform for mobility in this city, and we've really got to have more of the industries and major businesses in New York partnering with community colleges and getting those students in there. I think also workforce development. Too often when it comes to workforce development, we're talking about just placing someone into a job. So take all the retail jobs and restaurant jobs that are being created right now. The people are taking those jobs because that's what's available. It's what's available for people with limited skills. But if we can make sure that those retail jobs are not the end of the line, that are not a career, but actually the start of something else, because a lot of low-income people, they lack the soft skills, they don't have a lot of experience showing up for work on time, so those retail jobs are actually important to give people a foothold in the labor market. But we need to make sure that that's not the end and they can actually move up. So if we can rejigger our workforce programs to make sure that people with the job, like a retail job, actually can get into a training program to continue to build their skills and move on to something else.
If you were advising one of the candidates for mayor, what would you be telling them to say that will put them in a position where they can carry out some of these policies?
Wow. I think that, look, you've got to make jobs, you've got to make jobs, first of all, a #1 priority. Creating middle-class jobs, getting people into those kind of jobs. There's got to be more of an investment in workforce training than there has so far. I think that they've also got to really address that there's a skills gap. I mean, there's things that we can do on the edges. I mean, I mentioned port-related warehousing and trying to get people into paralegal jobs, but the real problem here is that far too many New Yorkers, an alarming number of New Yorkers, just don't have the skills to get the jobs that are being created in this economy. I mean, we're seeing in the kind of years since the recession that, you know, if you have a college degree, you are doing so much better than everybody that doesn't. But that's not going to change. And so we need to be investing not only in the kind of K through 12 education, but in community colleges. And there's just so much that needs to be done there. So I think that really taking on the skills crisis in this city is what I would recommend.
One of the problems for people further down on the economic ladder, I think, in this particular environment is that you have a whole bunch of people who were knocked down a rung or two. They weren't necessarily knocked flat on their backs by the recession, but they worked for Bear Stearns. Maybe they were an operations manager, a back office person. Now maybe they're an orderly in a hospital. They're competing for jobs with people who have less experience or less education than they are. And they are not necessarily getting back up to where they were. They may have taken a 50%, a 30%, a 25% cut to their income and are grateful that they're still working at all. But same thing, even at the higher ends, there are lawyers, young lawyers graduated from school, were ready to get into the job market, and they found out that they're now competing with lawyers who graduated 2 or 3 years earlier, but who didn't get the offers that they were expecting. So is the economy improving, or are we flat? Is the growth just because of population growth? Is New York doing better than other places around the country? Should we be optimistic or pessimistic at this point?
Well, New York is doing better than most places, but it's still particularly difficult. I mean, this is one of the worst or slowest recoveries since the Great Depression. And not only that, but then there's just this huge transformation in the economy. And so it's creating situations like what you were saying. I mean, people are coming out of college with some great schools, and they're working at the Apple Store for very little money. But there's a whole kind of domino effect from that. So people that could potentially get a job at the Apple Store with much less educational attainment, they can't get anything right now, or they're stuck, you know, in the kitchen at some restaurant for minimum wage right now. And so it's just, it's creating a bad situation. I mean, fundamentally, we need to create a lot more jobs. We haven't talked yet, Ken, about entrepreneurship. I mean, I think that, you know, this is something that the city has gotten behind a little more. We don't know exactly what's going to be growing right now. We know we need jobs. I mean, we're doing a study right now about how do you expand the number of low-income entrepreneurs.
I was going to ask you about that.
Well, we've seen a lot of people at the high end start tech companies. We've seen immigrants continue to start businesses at high levels, but we haven't yet seen a lot of low-income entrepreneurship. The rates are very low, and these days, when you don't have those middle-income manufacturing jobs to kind of fall into, we think that one pathway of achieving economic security is to start a business. And there's obviously a lot of risks. It's not for everybody. But right now, there's very little promotion or support of low-income people to try it and start a business.
There is money in low-income communities, and I think also, and the Social Compact, a think tank in Washington, has done a lot of research in this area. There is not an underground economy in the sense that people are trying to hide money, but an economy that just doesn't show up. It's people providing daycare for each other's kids, or it's the guy who's doing auto repairs on the sidewalk.
Cutting hair out of their apartment.
Cutting hair out of their apartment. Is there a way to help that sector of the economy? Buying co-ops, credit unions, I don't know what it is, but the money that can be recycled in poor neighborhoods, it seems to me, has the same benefit to the city as money that gets recycled in wealthier neighborhoods.
No doubt. I mean, there's so much opportunity. There's a lot of creativity in a lot of these communities, too. I think that the problem is that very few of those quote-unquote side hustles that we see a lot of times get formalized. And there's a lot of I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be done. I think there's a lack of mentors in a lot of low-income communities. We've got to do that. So when we do have minority business owners, we've got to make sure they mentor others. I think for a lot of the tech entrepreneurs that we're seeing today, I think we can match them with other people in low-income communities, help them, give them advice on how to start a business. But obviously capital is a big thing as well. Microfinance can play a role, but it's still at a fairly small scale in the city, and microfinance is not in a lot of low-income native-born communities. So
how has the recession treated the center? Tell our viewers a little bit about the organization is and what's on your horizon for the next year.
Well, we're a think tank. We write about how to grow and diversify New York's economy and how to expand economic opportunity. And it's been an interesting time because I think a lot of policymakers in the city are looking for ideas about how to grow the economy and how to get people into jobs. And so we've been pretty busy and we've been trying to come up with a lot of ideas. We've been putting ideas on the table where there's opportunities for growth, so tech, design, healthcare. We've been doing studies about those things. We're also looking at things like the importance of community colleges. We're about to publish a study about the role of the public libraries as kind of key institutions when it comes to human capital development. So we're doing a lot of things. We're trying to continue to push the envelope and not get into polarizing debates about issues, but really trying to put fresh ideas.
Matters of faith. Cut the budget, redistribute wealth. Matters of faith. Fact-based is what we're
fact-based and fresh ideas.
Well, Jonathan, I hope you'll come back next year, mayoral election, new city council. Hopefully we'll be hearing some of your ideas coming back from the candidates, but I'm sure they'll come up with a few on their own, and we hope you'll come back and give us your thoughts on how the debate is going to evolve over the course of the next year.
Anytime, would love to.
My thanks to Jonathan Bowles, Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide. Send your comments and suggestions to CityWide at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or contact us at cuny.tv.